Hey there. So today I'm going to talk, I got to put this down. I'm going to talk about reliability. I know we covered some of the big ideas, essentially classical test theory, in the previous week module, but I did that deliberately to kind of spread out the key concepts here because I've talked a bit now about what reliability is from a conceptual standpoint, and I apologize that it sounds very echoey right now because my current mug of coffee is metal, and apparently that is not good for audio. So, one second while I wrap this so that it doesn't echo. Yeah, this is a weird thing that I have learned way too much about. Okay. This instead of this nice metal mug is I've wrapped it in a scarf of mine so that it won't bounce as much because oh boy, the echoes are a nightmare to work with. But enough about that. Let's talk about reliability. Maybe. Yes? Okay. Cool. So, kind of as a roadmap today, what I'm going to do is talk about both broad reliability as an idea and as a more mathematical term, and kind of recapping what we approached last week, as well as talk about types of reliability and standard error of measurement. This week, there's a lot more written notes as opposed to video because we're shifting into R and I want to show you our code in the process. So please check out the class website. It's really important because that's how you're going to know how to do the homework. So yeah, do that. It's going to cover things that are not in the textbook, but you still need the textbook. So please do it. I realize that for those of you that do watch these videos, it's this seems weird that I have to plea this. I mean, because you're not my audience. If you're watching this, you're not who I'm worried about. But anyway, let's keep going so that I can get these recorded and uploaded. So yeah. Okay, so reliability is an idea. Reliability in kind of everyday language is more of a synonym for dependability and consistency. So when we speak of a train that is so reliable you can set your watch to it, or if you have a friend who you'd consider reliable, that friend is the one that's always there for you in a time of need. And that's great. Good for you to have that kind of train and friend in your life. Unfortunately, that is not how to think of reliability from a statistical and psychometrics based framework, or from a measurement and testing framework. All of those, I mean, they're all classical test theory. So broadly speaking, reliability is about consistency and measurement. And while in everyday conversation, reliability denotes something positive, in psychometrics, it really only refers to something that is consistent. It is not necessarily consistent good, consistent bad. It's merely consistent. It exists. It is a state. There's no value attached to it. All right, but it's really important for us as users of testing, tests and consumers of that information to know how reliable a test is and other measurement procedures are. But as you've kind of hopefully figured out, reliability is not an all or nothing thing. A test may be reliable in one context and less so in another. And so there are different types and degrees of reliability. And one kind of the common way to quantify that is with a reliability coefficient, which is an index. Now, an index is a proportion that indicates a ratio. And in our case, that is the ratio of true score variance on a test to total score. So Often these are calculated using correlations. For those of you who are familiar with what R squared is, big R squared, which is a proportion of variance explained in a regression model out of the total, that is what we're talking about here. It's total variance explained, and various values, various correlations can be converted into this score. And we'll talk about how to do that, but broadly speaking, there's a range of values that we look for. Just like for when you interpret a correlation, there tends to be like effect sizes of what you are looking for that are still field dependent and kind of context dependent. That is the case with reliability. So correlations that I would be thrilled with in a genetically informed study would be unacceptable. So there, like a 0.5 would be amazing. Here, 0.5 is you need to just scrap that whole test and just reevaluate your life choices because a 0.5 reliability is really bad. Like on the low end, test values need to have at least a 0.8 in reliability. Now, for some shorter tests, you can get away with 0.7. I've got a whole table of this, kind of with some writing and thoughts about it. But yeah, these values should be at least 0.8, which means that 80% of the variability in test performance is true score. Ideally, you want this to be closer to 95 for standardized tests that are high stakes that we use to make important decisions, like the GRE, the SAT, the ACT, any ability test that is one that that has spent time and money developing, not the stuff you find on BuzzFeed. The ideal is they're closer to that ideal of 0.95. So in other words, 95% of the variability in test performance is explained by true test performance and is not measurement error. So under classical test theory, we can essentially think of this as the correlation between our true score and our test score and square it so that we get it as variance explained. So essentially, this means that the proportion of x, so whatever our test is, that's the total test that can be explained by true score. So that's variance of true score divided by variance of test. And we can break that piece out. Let me know if you want to learn how to do that. So it's essentially the variance sum laws. They're really great. But for the sake of time and given the modality, I'm not going to crawl deeply into those. But what the implication of that math is that you can break apart the various components of variance. And that's why we use it. So we can break down the total proportion as true score plus error. And that error is irrelevant random sources of error. Yeah, and so this can't be measured directly, because if it could, we wouldn't have to do any of these kinds of studies to calculate reliability. We could just know. It'd be nice. But we have to use indirect methods to estimate this. So just to reiterate here, and we'll crawl deeper in, this is more like the qualitative overview to give you some orientation of where we're going, that reliability is an index of measurement consistency or how well a test holds together. It can range from 0 to 1, and the bigger number, better. These are the key ideas in case you missed those in the rest of this video. Now, under domain sampling theory, which is something we talked about back ages ago last week, we can think about reliability as kind of a measure of how similar various samplings of our test are. So we can think of like each random sampling from our domain as a randomly kind of equivalent test. And this should give you some kind of unbiased estimate. So if you were to infinitely make tests using domain sampling theory, so randomly sampling test questions that were universal and covering whatever your domain was, that would give you an unbiased estimate if you looked at the average correlation amongst them. And this would give you a really good estimate of true score versus test score. And now, obviously, we can't actually do this because, well, it would be unreasonable because we just can't have people take tests an infinite number of times or even develop an infinite number of questions. Well, that's a lot of time. And so while we can kind of replicate that, which is what I do on my quizzes by making kind of a random selection and then developing test questions based on that, it's still not ideal. So we have to estimate them indirectly. And so a first example is to look at the correlation of scores between two forms of the same test. So under domain sampling theory, we could just randomly sample test questions and make two forms. They should be the same on average. So as a first example, we can look at the correlation between two scores on the same test, which I've denoted here. So this correlation is estimated as the covariance, or the shared variance between the two distributions of our forms. Now this is divided by the product of the standard deviations, which in other words is the total available variance within each distribution. And x1 and x2 are test 1 and test 2 respectively. So you can essentially find the covariance between the two and divide that by the total, by the two separate variances. That's it. I know the math seems scary, but it's really straightforward. It's how your two performances move together versus how each move by themselves. Okay, so that is the big ideas in reliability. Please don't skip this one, although I realize now that I'm saying this, those of you who have skipped wouldn't have seen this. So I don't know. One thing that could be fun is if you want a bonus engagement activity, include in your notes for this week the name of my 3 cats in your how did you engage? Fun facts. All 3. Or at least, no, I'll take it. Just give me 2. So yeah, I'll see you in a bit. Bye.